Okay. And so hopefully everybody is able to see the screen all fine and dandy. And it is going to be myself, Angie Hung. I'm the coordinator for the East Metro Water Education Program and joined by Lori. And I'm just, let's see, gonna be the one that I think kicks things off, and then I'm gonna turn it over to Lori to actually start our presentation today. But the whole focus of this workshop is to talk about restoring pollinator habitat. And it's something that is a relatively easy step any person can take in your own yard. And by maximizing the number of people we have doing this in our communities, we can actually make a pretty sizable impact on the health of pollinators and birds and other wildlife species and create connected corridors. So we're going to talk about attracting pollinators with native plants and a lot of the resources to get started. I have been working at the East Metro Water Education Program since 2006, and I'm now working across Ramsey, Washington, Chisago, and Isani County. What's been really exciting over the past 20 years is just seeing how much this idea of native gardening has really taken off. When I started, it was rare to find somebody who had native plants in their yard, and now we've got somewhere close to 5,000 native planting projects just in Washington County. So this is my contact information. I talked just long enough to turn things over to Lori. And then I think she's gonna pick it up for the next, there we go, next couple of set of slides.
Great. Thank you. So I'm Lori Maxfield, and I am serving the Washington Conservation District as a Climate Corps Impact Coordinator. This is my second year with the Conservation District, so it's been a real exciting opportunity for me to continue to pursue my avocation instead of being in a vocation. And so while I've always been really interested in the natural environment, um, planting, gardening, all those good things, it's really fun to now go into the depth and understand why I'm doing some of the things instead of just doing them. And so the service with the Conservation District has been really an awesome experience. Prior to that, I was an educator serving in higher ed and also pre-K 12 settings. And then I have a few minor hobbies here and there. All right, it doesn't want to advance.
I feel like it's been the case that I have to like first click the mouse on the slide and then hit the forward button. Or do I have to re-give you permission to share? I
You
bet
might
you,
have to redo the permissions.
yeah, okay. Um, all right, try that and see if it works now.
Feels like 2020 in here.
I know.
There we go.
All right. Do you want me to cover this part, Lori?
Sure, if you want to, go ahead.
This is roughly a map of the service area where our local partnership is working. And so, as the name implies, we're on the east side of the Twin Cities Metro, but then also stretching up into Chisago and Isani County. Some of the really cool things that we offer to local landowners is free site visits, first of all. Those don't usually start until April, but you can have a conservation district person come out to your property, walk around it with you, help you design a planting project, help you apply for grants, and give you just a lot of really great advice on invasive species management and other things. As I mentioned, there are cost share grants. I think pretty much everybody here has heard maybe of the lawns to legumes grants that are available through the state, but the watershed districts also often offer stewardship grants or cost share grants. And those can be anywhere from $500 to $15,000, just depending on how big the project might be and how much of an impact it will have on water resources in your area. We put on tons of workshops. We've got a lot of volunteer planting events scheduled for the spring, and just have a really great depth of expertise among our staff. Lori and I are only two of about 20 people that are at our office. And so We have people that know all about lake, stream, river, and wetland health, habitat restoration, conservation farming, kind of you name it. If it's in that wheelhouse of natural resources management, we've probably got somebody that can help you out with the question. Okay, so now it's back to you, Lori.
So we're going to talk a little bit about restoring the pollinator habitat, looking at common insect pollinators in Minnesota landscapes, the importance of insect pollinators, the decline of insect pollinator species, and some of the threats that our insect pollinator species face. And one of the things that I just picked up on in this last week, when we're going to be talking about some of the insect pollinators, we're also going to be talking about daytime pollinators and nighttime pollinators. I won't go into a lot of details on those, but know that our nocturnal pollinators, our evening pollinators, also face some of the same issues as our daytime pollinators. So this comes from the University of Minnesota. When we start looking at who our insect pollinators are, we usually a lot of times immediately think of bees, wild bees, the honeybees, the variety of different types of bees that they're out there, all the way from the leafcutter to the mining bees, mason bees, sweat bees, and we see them frequently in our gardens and in our native plantings, and so we're very familiar with those groups. And just a couple of fun facts: Minnesota is home to 50 plus species of bees and 157 species of butterflies. Only the female stings, and it's a modified ovipositor. And that's true for every species of bee on Earth. And there are over 20,000 bee species. So we have just a small chunk of them.
Tina, your outfit. I forgot your outfit. Oh, shoot. Okay, we got to go back. Oh, no.
Whoops.
Hey, Lori, there we go.
Did it go back? Ah, whoops. Keeps shifting here. So some more fun facts. If we could get it to stay on the page. I don't know what's going on, Angie. It's not okay. So we covered our bees. And now we'll take a look at some of the other pollinators that we may not think of as frequently. So we have the true flies, a number of different families of flies that serve as pollinators. We also have wasps, beetles, and then of course our butterflies and moths. One of the reasons that I think we focus on bees a lot is because with the bees, the wild bees are probably the most efficient pollinators. As we start getting down with some of our other pollinators, such as wasps and beetles, they aren't necessarily as efficient due to their structures, but they are definitely pollinators, and they also serve some other great purposes as well, especially as we'll talk a little more about the wasps and their use as predators of insects, pests that we may not want. So the importance of insect pollinators.
I see what you're saying. It just keeps hopping, hey?
Yeah. And the thing of it is I'm not doing anything. So the importance of insect pollinators, why are they important? And I think all of you probably know these things, but they definitely support plant life. And without plant life, there are a lot of things that would be absolutely miserable for all of the wildlife as well as humans. And in the past, approximately 80% of the world's flowering plant species depend on animal pollination. In 2011, there was a study that bounced it up to about 87.7% of flowering plants reliant on pollinators. And now in a 2023 study, they found that about 90% of flowering plants are reliant on pollinators. There are over 20,000 species or 200,000 species of animals that act as pollinators. Of that, approximately 1,000 are hummingbirds, bats, and other small mammals such as mice. Insects are the remaining pollinators. So we can see how important it is to continue to provide habitat, given that we have a large number of insects that are the pollinators that are critical for supporting plant life. We also know that it's beneficial to supporting wildlife. Through the pollination services that our insect pollinators provide us, it provides the seed and fruit production that our wildlife needs and eats. It also, for us human beings that are eaters as well, it supports food crops. 75% of food crops require pollinators, and of that 75%, 35% of the world food crops are pollinator dependent, which equals to about 1 out of every 3 bites of foods. And there are some that are somewhat dependent on pollinators. They could get by without them and still be productive and provide yields. But there are some highly dependent fruits and nuts and other agricultural commodities that are important for pollinators. So just to give you a sense of some of the highly dependent fruit trees: apples, apricots, blueberries, cherries, mangoes, peaches, plums, pears, and raspberries. So without the insect pollinators, we would see severe declines in those fruits. With our nuts, we're looking at almonds, koala nuts, avocados. Can't go without those avocados. And then as we start looking at others, some of our vegetable crops and grain crops, cucumber. I would be really sorely disappointed if I still didn't have cucumber in my diet. Buckwheat, and then we get into some spices: nutmeg, anise, fennel, coriander. So those are highly dependent on pollinators, and severe lack in production would be devastating to those food crops. Essential food crops that if we lose our pollinators, we probably lose these crops: kiwis, melons, pumpkins, watermelons, cocoa beans, Brazil nuts, and vanilla and quinces. So they're very, very important to a variety of plants that we need, and especially our food crops. Additionally, that supports a lot of biodiversity. It's really important that we have the pollinators because it supports the biodiversity. It improves our ecosystem health, which is very critical to both us and our other species that live on the earth. Economic, clearly, we've talked a little bit about the potential with agriculture, but there are other economic issues that could occur in the areas of cosmetics and pharmaceuticals. We also can take a look at cultural and aesthetic value. The loss of our pollinators and key plants could create some challenges for cultures that depend on particular plants for ceremonies, spiritual value, and then also art and literature. So we have a number of things that are impacted. And then one of the last impacts we have if we lose our plants because we don't have our pollinators is the soil health. Not continuing that good soil health. We know that native plants are very beneficial to the soil and erosion control. So keeping these 199,000 species of insect pollinators viable is really important. See if it goes this time.
I'll just advance it for you.
Okay. So we've seen the decline in insect pollinators. Recently, this comes from the Xerces Society, that we've seen 28% of the bumblebee species, wild bees, in decline. 19% of butterflies in the United States are at risk of extinction. Lady beetles, definitely starting to see with some of the invasive ones, some increases in those. And then the common ones that are native, we're seeing losses in those. Leafcutter bees, 50% of them have declined, and 27% of mason bees. I think most of those live in my yard. I have lots of mason bees, which always excites me every year along those lines. So very, very huge decline starting to see that. And I don't know if people saw the report in California where they track the number of monarch butterflies, and it was below 10,000, I believe, this year. So there's some huge declines happening with our butterflies, and especially the monarch. I popped up a thing from the Minnesota State Agency Pollinator Report back in 2018, and it identified a few of Minnesota's imperiled pollinators. Many of these we are familiar with our rusty-patched bumblebee, the Dakota skipper butterfly, the monarch butterfly, and then a couple of others, the Karner blue butterfly, and then the yellow-banded bumblebee. And then additionally, there are a number of other species that are at risk in Minnesota. And some of them, it's due to they are pollinator specialists. And what's happening, for example, with the nude yellow loosestrife bee, they are specialists. The only thing that they pollinate is the our loosestrife species, and their young depend on the pollen coming from those species. And as the loosestrife is removed from the habitat, we're starting to see a decline in those. And there are a number of other critters that we could eventually see decline in. Okay, we can go forward.
Here with confidence, I said, I'll advance it. There we go.
So threats to pollinators. Well, one of the ones that we commonly think of right away are the use of pesticides. And when we're talking about pesticides, we're not only just talking about insecticides, but we're also talking about the herbicides and fungicides that we oftentimes use in yards and both in commercial and agricultural areas. So the insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides create lots of issues for our pollinators. When we look at some of the insecticides and herbicides, especially those that are systemic, one of the challenges with those is that it doesn't, it's not like once you spray it and a week later, it's okay, everything goes away. They infiltrate the whole plant, the stems, the leaves, the flowers, the soil, the roots. And so that systemic pesticide, insecticide starts to create huge problems. And not only are they systemic, but they're also long lasting. And the Xerces Societies has some really good information on it here. The one that we've heard about, especially with the insecticide, the use of neonicotinoids, and the issues with that. And you can see in this particular diagram that they share the systemic nature of it and also the persistence of it. Herbicides are very much like the insecticides. Again, they cause great issues for our pollinators. And the fungicides, they are starting to see that there are some issues with fungicides. They are not necessarily quite as quick acting on our pollinator species and insect friends as are the insecticides and herbicides, and sometimes it is cumulative rather than killing them right away or causing problems with them. But the fungicides definitely start to cause subtle and significant changes, both in their reproductive cycles and also in their habitat. And so fungicides are another thing that we need to start thinking about. And we know that they're exposed to these pesticides in different ways. Direct contact, where they accidentally get sprayed. Residual contact, where walking on the plant or on the flower. Contaminated nesting material, where it gets down into the nesting material. And not only when we think about the monarch butterfly and you take a look at milkweed that's been sprayed, that laying those eggs on that contaminated stem of the milkweed contaminates that nesting material for those sweet little caterpillars that will one day emerge, and that causes problems. And then contaminated nesting areas. And we definitely see this with ground, more of our ground dwelling critters, which many of our bees are. They do dwell in the ground. And so those nesting areas also become contaminated. So those are the different ways in which they are exposed to the use of any pesticides. So now we have the threats to habitat loss. And one of the first ones, whoops.
I'm thinking there's probably a time delay when you're doing it from your screen. It seems like you click and then it's maybe
okay.
10
Well, we'll
seconds.
give it a shot on that and see what happens. Sorry about this, folks. One of the first habitat losses, one of the big ones is destruction. And destruction is a complete elimination of the natural ecosystem. And it never really recovers, and it cannot sustain the natural plant life, the natural, our pollinators, the insect pollinators, and other critters. It's just totally devastated, and there is nothing left. So destruction is one of the forms of habitat loss. The next one we have is fragmentation. And I couldn't find a good picture, so this is a graphic illustration of that. So we have these beautiful hillsides, mountainous areas that were one time beautiful ecosystems, natural habitats, lots of wildlife, pollinators, plant life. And we put a road through it. We put different types of buildings, urbanization, and we fragmented that habitat. And so for our pollinators, there's the loss of the habitat in that particular situation, but also they no longer have a connected habitats. And so moving from one area to other becomes very challenging for them. So we fragment the natural ecosystem into smaller chunks and parcels. And then the last one is degradation. And that's a little bit different than destruction, in that part of the natural habitat is still there, but we have changed that habitat through pollution, doing other types of things to it that causes the habitat to still be in existence, but it's not as viable as it once was. The plant life may not be able to sustain itself as well. It doesn't flower. It may not flower properly and at varying times, and so it creates all kinds of problems in that, which then causes problems for the pollinators in that they are not able to get food. So degradation is where we alter it in such a way that it still produces, but it is not as efficient as it once was. So that's another set of issues for our pollinators. The next one is climate change, and we know that that is definitely happening. This comes from the Climate Adaptation Partnership, and this is for East Central Minnesota, in which part of Washington County is. And you can take a look at the summer and winter temperatures. We can see that their projected change in average maximum temperature, it is increasing. It is getting warmer. So we're definitely seeing warmer summers, warmer winters, and where we're definitely seeing the increases in our temperatures is the winter temperature is increasing. Now, a couple of weeks ago, if you'd asked me that, I said, nah, it's still cold, but definitely we're seeing average temperatures, winter temperatures are increasing dramatically. And then also, precipitation is also where we're starting to see some huge changes. So again, in spring and summer, and last year was a really great example of that, where we saw that we had very heavy rains through from about mid-March through about June, late July, and then suddenly in August everything dried up. And so we're starting to see a shift in when the precipitation is happening, and also huge changes in that as well. So you can see that we're starting to see in the summer that we're having seasonal changes in precipitation, where we're getting less and less precipitation. And our winters also, with our winter snow cover, we're also seeing less snowfall than we have in the past. Also, issues with climate change are the extreme droughts or extreme flooding, that we're seeing extreme weather events more frequently and in more severity than we have historically. Other threats to our insect pollinators are non-native invasive plant species. And just picked a couple of Minnesota favorite ones: wild parsnip, the Grecian foxglove, and the garlic mustard. There are many others, but definitely these crowd out our native plants and reduce the quality of the habitat for our pollinators. And so we have the non-native invasive plant species that are also causing problems for our pollinators. And then the last set of threats we'll talk about are parasites and pathogens. In most cases, there's not, those are just things that happen naturally with parasites and pathogens. A lot of the parasites that we're finding are coming from our managed bees. So the honeybees, we know that with the colony collapse, parasites have created great problems for them. But when they move out of their hive and move to other plants, they deposit some of those parasites, and our wild bees pick them up. And you can see in the one picture below
You passed
we
it.
have,
I know
we
it's
have
very big.
honeybees, and you have a small parasitic mite there, and then on the wild bumblebee up by his one wing, we can see a small parasite there as well. So parasites and pathogens are also creating problems for our pollinators. And then talking about our nocturnal, they face all of those other issues, but another threat to them is light pollution. Most of them depend on natural light from the stars, the moon, those types of things for their navigation. Our artificial light totally screws up their navigation systems, and they become very confused and unable to do their pollination. It also makes them more susceptible to predators that are out in the night, in that they're easier to spot and find, and knocks our nocturnal pollinators. So light pollution is an extra threat and stressor that our nighttime pollinators face. And I think now it's your turn, Angie.
Excellent. So Lori just kind of talked through this whole array of really big picture problems that are happening. And I
Good. Thanks for taking
all
her
right,
over there. Yeah, you're
one
welcome. Do you
moment.
need to sit by Anna? So I
Gotta
Very
mute
quick,
all.
man. Hug attack.
All right, there we go. And I realize that oftentimes, right around now in the presentation, there is a tendency to start to feel a sense of doom and hopelessness. Like, what is it that I can do in the midst of all of these big picture problems that we have? But the reality is that in Minnesota, 75% of all of our land is privately owned. So the community, we, the people who live in homes and neighborhoods, we're the ones who actually have the power to change what our landscapes look like. And even if you are just planting one native garden in your yard, it is actually playing a really big role in helping to rebuild habitat corridors for wildlife and clean water. And this gorgeous garden right here is from one of the master gardeners, Bonnie Duran, who lives in Lake Elmo, and planted this with help from Washington Conservation District and Valley Branch Watershed District about 20 years ago. So what you are looking at right now is a map of the native landscape that was in the Twin Cities metro area in about 1885. When European Americans first began settling Minnesota, they actually took meticulous records about where there were forests, what kind of forests they were, where there were prairies, where there were lakes and wetlands. So we know that this is what the climate or what the habitat was like about 150 to 200 years ago. And unfortunately, we have relatively little native plant communities remaining, especially in our developed areas. Where we do find it is places like up in the Anoka Sand Plain, along the Mississippi, Minnesota, and St. Croix rivers, and then in a little bit of pockets. But the good news is that we can also see evidence of recreating habitat corridors. So wanted to share this example of how far it is that a pollinator can fly to find food. I think we're all pretty familiar with the monarch butterflies. They're this really dramatic migration story, migrating from places like Minnesota all the way down to Mexico. But we also have insects like the bicolored green sweat bee, and it only flies about 500 feet. So that gives you an idea of how frequently we need to have these native plantings in order to fully support the insects. It's not enough to just have a couple of big plantings in regional parks. We also have to have it on private land. But what we are looking at right here is an outline of the city of Minneapolis. And on the left-hand side, we have the existing known high-quality habitat, which, as I mentioned earlier, was mostly along the lakes and along the river. This set of maps was created about 10 years ago, and so hopefully it would look more impressive now. But what we did is that Metro Blooms added on a 200-meter buffer around all of those existing habitat areas, which is about the distance that a small pollinator flies. And then they looked at all the people who had come to their pollinator planting workshops or had gotten lawns to legumes grants and gone home and planted a garden. And they added all of those people in. And you can see that we very quickly begin to fill in the map. So places that didn't used to have habitat are now beginning to be connected. Our new state bee, the rusty patch bumblebee, is a species of concern that we are really interested in trying to support. And they need to have blooming native flowers throughout the growing season and connected high quality habitat. And I show them just to note that we have a pretty good idea of where the rusty patch bumblebee ideal habitat is located. So on the left-hand side is showing the upper Midwest and the East, and you can see there is a whole lot of ideal habitat in southeastern Minnesota and Wisconsin, Illinois, and Iowa. And on the right-hand side, we've got a map of Washington County where we have orange blobs showing current locations where there are known populations of rusty patch bumblebees. And so it stands to reason that with a little bit of public engagement, we can grow these patches and be able to reconnect habitat for these insects. All right. So Lori is going to spend a little bit of time talking about what a project at your property might look like. But I want to encourage you to think a little bit broader than just having a flower garden. Because in reality, the best thing that you can do for insects in the early spring is to have a native tree or a shrub that has flowers and provides an early source of nectar. We love it if we can double dip, if we can have a native garden that is also a rain garden, and so we're getting water quality treatment, or a native garden that also is planted along a lake shore, and so it helps to stabilize your shoreline from eroding. So think outside the box and be creative in terms of what you can do with a project. Okay, Laurie, take it away.
Well, I was just, shoot. So this picture here, just going to point out a couple of things of it. This was my first pollinator garden. Hadn't given much thought to it. We just decided we were going to put in a pollinator garden. We had an open space and it looked like a nice place. We got the plants from a local nursery and cleaned the area up and just planted them. And it was, a wonderful experience in terms of the beautiful plants that we got. We've got some black-eyed Susan, some anise hyssop, some mountain mint, some royal catchfly. I love the royal catchfly because it catches those nasty Japanese beetles and they end up getting stuck on there. So that was kind of nice. Some mallow, there's some monarda and a variety of other plants. And so it's really done well with the butterfly weed. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. One of the things I want to point out off to the upper right-hand corner, you'll see this beautiful willow tree, which Angie was talking about the importance of planting trees as well. And willows are a really important tree and species for our pollinators. So willows are a nice beneficial, but later we'll talk about what happened with this willow tree. So we're going to spend just a little bit of time at looking at some of the various types of plantings that we might potentially do. Flowering trees and shrubs, they're definitely a plus if you don't have a lot of space in your yard or you're looking for providing benefits for the pollinators as well as for your area. They make some really nice nice additions to that to your property. And there are a variety of trees that are very beneficial. There are a few listed here: the willows, the basswoods, a lot of the fruit trees, and then definitely a lot of shrubs. And they just add some nice appeal to the yard. And definitely with those early pollinators, when those bumblebees come out, I usually have a little competition between the bumblebees and my apple trees as they fly through and I'm walking through there. So it's always makes me always feel really good when those bumblebees are buzzing through the apple and cherry trees. So they're very beneficial. I want to share one tree that's a very interesting tree, especially if it's a native hawthorn tree, is that it's a really nice tree that gives year-round impact. You can see that in the one corner we have the beautiful flowers and one of our pollinators working away on it. In the winter, it gives some very nice character to the yard. And with its fruits, it provides food for the wildlife. And it hosts a variety of moths, butterflies, and of course, many other pollinators. And there is one slightly disturbing fact about the hawthorn tree. We have a number, there are a couple of Minnesota birds called shrikes, the northern shrike and the loggerhead shrike. And actually, the loggerhead is one that's listed as a species of concern and is rare. But what they do is they capture their mouse or whatever it is that they might catch, and then they use the hawthorn tree and the spikes on it to pin their prey down so that it's easier for them to eat. So they're oftentimes also called the butcher bird. So it's a little disturbing fact, but again, that's just the way nature works.
Nope. I tried to help you and made it go.
Yeah, it clicks, but it doesn't want to. One of the other things, and Heather Holm has a great website if you ever check her site out. She has some good books. Another thing, let's say that you've already got that tree on the yard, on the property, and you're trying to figure out what else could I do. One of the things that you could do is look at doing a soft landing. And what you're doing with that soft landing is simply planting some diverse native plants underneath those trees. And they can be keystone trees or they could be other types of trees. We know some of our oaks, willows that are very important trees to our habitats. Definitely could use that. And a lot of times when you look underneath their trees, not a lot's growing underneath them anyway. So doing some native plantings underneath the trees will provide a critical habitat for moths, butterflies, bees, and beetles. And especially for the moths, that can be a very beneficial planting with the soft landings. And typically what you're going to do is you're going to buy small plants. You're going to use a small trowel to kind of open up a little bit of spot because you don't want to damage the tree. And typically you're going to want to stay between 2 and 3 feet away from the trunk, that area. If you need to, you can smother the existing vegetation if there are some creeping Charlie or something growing under it and you're trying to get rid of it, rather than digging it up, because again, you don't want to destroy and damage the tree roots. And then if you need to, you can also build some of the duff and leaf litter under it. And one of the key things is don't create a raised bed. So don't put a bunch of soil on top of it and then put the plants in. And if you do the small plugs, those typically, rather than a potted native plant, the small plugs will eventually take over. And so the soft landings, if you've already got an existing space and trees, could be a beneficial planting that you could provide for pollinators. Shoreline stabilization, some very beautiful plantings that can happen with that. And again, using native plants. And there are a variety of wonderful plants that actually prefer to grow along the shorelines and do some very nice work with both controlling erosion and filtering stormwater runoff that might be flowing into our lakes. And again, if done right, as Angie pointed out, it also provides a wonderful habitat for our pollinators. We see lots of the milkweeds there, a variety of other nice native plants, and it provides that full season coverage. This is one type of planting that probably you're going to want some expertise coming in and helping you with doing shoreline plantings. We also have some turf alternatives. So we can either do pollinator or bee lawns. And typically the mix that they've talked about from the University of Minnesota includes a couple of fine fescues, some Dutch white clover, creeping thyme, and self-heal. And this is at some of the pictures are from the Washington Conservation District, where we have a pollinator lawn. And it's fun to go out there at lunchtime. A lot of times I go out and look at the bees, the dragonflies, and other critters that are out there. There is also, and you can see this is in a nice sunny spot. There's also a perennial ground cover in which, again, you're going to go with low growing hardy forbs. Again, it could be the creeping thyme, the self-heal, also prairie smoke, a variety of others make some really nice perennial ground cover. The difference between the perennial ground cover and the bee lawn is the sunlight. Pollinator lawns, bee lawns typically require lots of sunlight. Both the plants and the bees. Bees are there by their nature, they prefer the sun. The perennial ground cover, what's nice about that can grow in shadier areas or areas that only have partial sun. And then we have the low maintenance turfs, which you have low mow or no mow fescues that kind of take over the yard. And so those can be different types of plantings. Those take a little more work to establish. And again, that might be where you might want to get some assistance and some expertise in doing those. Not impossible to do on your own. Pollinator meadows, these are, for people who have lots of acreage, these are wonderful ways to restore the natural habitat, especially if there's been some disturbances. They're very large planting areas. You can see in this particular photo that it's not somebody's backyard. It's not a side yard. It's a very large, expansive area where you've got both water bodies. You've also got the trees. And so these are very large areas, and they provide a nice protected environment for pollinators. They're not typically, when we get into our pollinator meadows, they're not necessarily areas that we as humans are going to be walking through and doing a lot of things in those areas like we would in our yards. Not that it bothers the critters, but definitely it's very protected and restores itself into a much more native landscape. And much like where Angie was showing the pictures earlier with the native plant communities that we had years ago and where we are now, this is one way to bring those communities back. Whoops. Pocket plantings. These are typically the ones that a lot of us are going to do because they're fairly easy to do. They're usually very small scale plantings, and they attract the pollinators, the wildlife. They provide beauty. They provide the wonderful, valuable ecosystem services with the carbon sequestration, soil improvement, and air purification. And they help our whole urban ecosystem, especially in areas. You can see we have boulevard plantings on the far left that serve as a pocket planting. You can see in the middle picture a little more formal planting for some pocket plantings. And then in the far right, again, some pocket plantings. The nice thing about these is that you can just pick various parts of your yard to begin the pocket plantings. And what we've done at our home and what we're continuing to do is when we lose a tree, we still have lots of trees. That's actually where we put a new pocket planting in. Let's say that you're limited on space. You don't have the opportunity. You don't have a yard. Maybe you're living in a townhome, a condominium apartment. One of the new pushes is now to start looking at container planting with natives. And it's really pretty simple to build your container garden. You simply find a good sized container, cover the drain holes, and put in mulch at the bottom, and then you put in the soil. Be sure you use potting soil. Don't use garden soil. Many of you have maybe heard of stories where people used garden soil or compost, and the pot through sun and stuff spontaneously combusts, gets too hot. So be sure you're using potting soil. And then here you can see that it looks like there might be some prairie drop seed, maybe some alum, some maybe black-eyed Susans. You can see that you can do both grasses and the forbs in there. And then you can create this nice, beautiful container garden. And here, a couple of examples. This comes from the Blue Thumb website. This shows how you can just take a simple rectangular 15 by 31 inch planter and put in a variety of different types of native planters, or you can go with a large 32-inch circular planter. And again, look at all the plants that you can pack into there. And you can also do the shady plantings as well. Again, same size containers, and you can get bigger containers along those lines. So container plants, if you're limited on space or don't have access to a yard, definitely container plantings could be a way to also help. Options for existing spaces, again, it attracts other beneficial insects, and here's a couple of wildflowers for beneficial insects for fruit and vegetable growers. So you've got this beautiful vegetable garden, and maybe you want to add a few native plants in there to increase the pollinators in there to increase your tomato yields. So definitely adding in a few native plants could definitely add some pieces to your vegetable and your fruit trees, and also ornamental flower gardens. And it also brings in some of the other beneficial insects. A couple of them, for example, paper wasps. They like common and swamp milkweed, wild quinine, and mountain mints. And my mountain mint is always full of all kinds of different wasps. It's so much fun to watch them. Some other thing that is nice about attracting these beneficial insects in, going back to our use of pesticides, is that as we bring in some of these beneficial insects with some of the native plants, it also provides a predator-prey relationship on the insects that we don't want in our gardens and our yards. So we definitely have a variety of different types of beneficial insects beyond our bees. And wasps are very good in both being parasitic and predators as well. So wasps, I'm learning to be more appreciative of the benefits that they provide, and also the small pollination. I am still not ready to consider mosquitoes a pollinator. Still not there yet, folks. So they're definitely beneficial insects. One that's very interesting is the soldier beetle. We also have an invasive species called the brown marmoted stink bug. And so sometimes they can get confused with each other if you don't look at them carefully. The spine soldier bug, when you think about the spines, if you look at the shoulders on this guy, you can see that he has spikes or spines kind of on the edges of them. Whereas the stink bug, his shoulders will be rounded. So that's how you can tell the difference between those two critters. Otherwise, at a quick glance, they look the same. But definitely the spine soldier beetle is a very beneficial insect. Angie, you might have to advance it. I've gotten something funny happening on the screen here.
Oh, certainly.
And then key steps to creating your project. Remember when I told you about that beautiful willow tree that was in the yard off the backside of the pollinator garden that established? Well, here's what was left of the willow tree. Unfortunately, it had become diseased and old. And so this time, knowing a little bit more about doing and establishing a pocket planting, I decided to be more thoughtful and planful about how I would put in a new pollinator garden. So the first thing we did was we looked at the usable area. we assessed the site. And so once we got the stump ground out and got all of that work done, we were left with this space. And I didn't have to go for one because we had just had the tree service come through and they did all the work on that. So I knew where all the lines and everything are. But be sure to call before you dig to make sure that you are not getting any utility lines. They will only do the public lines, not your private lines. So be sure to give them a call and then plan. So we looked at this area and definitely it had a lot of clay soil. There was a lot of rock in it. So it was about a 2-year project to allow it to get the stump and have everything kind of decompose in there, and also putting a lot of compost in it. And then we put the limestone rock around it. And last summer, I planted it. I picked out the various plants that I wanted, installed it, and then have been maintaining and weeding it. The one thing I would do differently that I now know better is you'll see that right now it's just the soil. I did mulch it. It does have mulch on it, shredded bark or shredded mulch, double shredded mulch, which makes it really nice. Next time I will put the mulch down first and then put the plants in, because I was out there very carefully. It's a little bit on a sloped area, very carefully walking around the plants, as well as trying not to end up sliding down the slope as I was doing that. And in the background, you can see the established pollinator garden behind that. And then it's basically letting it, the first year, let it sleep. The next year it will creep. And then in the third year, you will expect it to leap. And so it's a fun project. I'm excited to see what it looks like this spring. I know I have a few things to replant, as I have discovered that some of my herbivore friends love to eat a variety of the plants I planted. I think it goes back to you now.
Excellent. Okay, well, Lori shared her story, and so I thought it was only fair that I share my gardening story as well. So what you are looking at right now is my home in Stillwater on the day that we moved in. And you can tell that it is a rather unimpressive yard. On the upside, it was a completely blank slate. But basically, we just had turf and, a couple of these itty bitty little foundation shrubs, and that was it. So you get to work and you start planning and you start gardening and you sweat and you toil and you're digging dirt and you're putting down mulch and you're tearing outside. And I have to warn you that it is really unimpressive in those first couple of months. So what you are looking at on the left is a photo from 8 months after I planted my boulevard strip. This was one of the first gardens that I did. I was actually 6 months pregnant with my son at the time. And if you can see in the far distance, there's a church at the end of our block, and all the people that were going to the church festival kept walking by and like, tisk, 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 because I was out there working in the sun. But 8 months later, it's the next spring. It kind of looks like nothing, to be totally honest. 10 months later, it's the next summer. We had a few flowers, but this is still not the garden of my dreams. Carrying forward, kept going, kept picking off little by little. You can see that those shrubs are getting a little bit bigger. We took a little bit more. I keep saying we, really it was me. My husband's not into gardening. It was me. So I'm using the royal we here. The little guy who's now big, he helped out as well. But kept taking little bits of turf out of commission and planting them as gardens. And here we are now 3 years or 2.5, 3 years after planting. You can see it's starting to finally look like a garden. The thing that I really love about native gardens is that they will look very different from one year to the next, and even from 1 month to the next. So in June, our boulevard garden, you can see, is very green and white. And then by the time you get to September, it's filled with yellow flowers. So there's this constant change as things bloom and then they fade away, and new things are blooming and fading away. And it's important that you do have enough diversity and variety in your gardens that they do have blooms throughout the growing season. But anyway, these are 3 years later. Wow. Okay, so this is what I always dreamed it was going to look like when I started that garden. But do you notice how much later this was? 8 years later. It was 8 years after planting before I finally got that wow impact. So yes, it is something that you're going to have to commit to and recognize that you're not going to, this is not one of those moments in life where you get instant gratification. It's something that you commit to, but once you get it to this point, it really is kind of a self-sustaining system that will keep going year after year. So, carrying on then. Let's talk about some of the plants that you might include. When I talk to people about pollinator gardens, one of the first things that a lot of people will say is, oh dear, oh my, I can't do it because I have shade. And you are not right. If you have shade, there is still a whole world of beautiful native plants. And there are even native plants that do bring in pollinators. So just a few options to consider. Wild geraniums and columbines are options of flowering plants that grow in the shade. There's a whole world of ferns. And then if you start thinking about adding texture and something that's going to look nice throughout the entire spring, summer, early fall, you can also get into this whole world of sedges and grasses. If you are on the edge of a sunny and shady area, maybe it's getting 3 to 6 hours of direct sun, you are going to be able to have a little bit more variety in what you can plant, and a few more of the flowering plants are going to kind of turn up in your plant palette. I always like to include a photo of the bottle blue gentian that's down there in the bottom corner, because this is one of the beautiful late bloomers. I think it's fun also because it's blue and because the flowers never open up. They are always kind of closed like that. But bumblebees are able to vibrate at just the right frequency that they can will their little furry buns in there and get at the pollen that's inside the flowers. If you have full sun, this is where you really kind of have the whole world as your oyster, and any number of grasses and flowers that you can be thinking about incorporating into your gardens. And then it's really a challenge more so to think about height and how you might select against some of those tall plants if it's going to be the boulevard garden, or towards those tall plants if it's something you're putting in a side yard along a fence. Just to show some more beautiful flowers that you could think of incorporating. The prairie blazing star and the meadow blazing star in particular are great if you want to bring in monarch butterflies, because as soon as they start blooming, I guarantee it's like monarch candy. The butterflies will be all over them. So on that topic of butterflies, and here is my proof that the butterflies will be all over it if you plant the blazing star. We have 157 species of butterflies that live in Minnesota. And so it's not just about the monarchs, even though we do love the monarchs. It's about protecting and nurturing that whole array of butterflies that are also very fun to see in our yards. And more than 500 species of bees that live in Minnesota. I got my hair cut earlier today. And when I was talking to my hairdresser, she said, ooh, if I planted a pollinator garden, would it attract bees also, though? Because I'm allergic. And I said, you know what? I'm actually also allergic to bees. And I will tell you that the vast majority of bees do not harm people. We have a lot of bee species that are solitary. They might be ground nesting. They're very docile. 9 times out of 10, when you get stung, it's going to be by a yellow jacket wasp. And it's usually because you're sitting near a garbage can, you're at a picnic, there's spilled soda, spilled beer, something like that. But all of those bees and wasps that come to my garden, I mean, I'm like right up in their business. I've got my phone, I'm taking videos of them, I'm taking photos of them, and they really are docile and don't bother me. So don't worry that just because you bring bees to your yard, it's going to pose some kind of risk. So if you want to support monarch butterflies, and I entirely encourage you to plant things to support monarch butterflies, you're going to want to start with milkweed. Common milkweed is one that I think most of us grew up knowing about because, they had the big fat leaves and you tear it open and that white sap comes out. And in a lot of places, it was considered to be a weed. I know I've talked to people who grew up on farms and they said, oh my gosh, yeah, the common milkweed, we were always having to pull it out of the ditches. But there are actually other varieties of milkweed that grow native to Minnesota as well. The butterfly milkweed is one that is a little bit shorter and it grows in drier areas like in prairies. It doesn't grow as tall and it's not as much of a spreader. The swamp milkweed, like the name implies, is one that grows in wetlands or it's good in the bottom of a rain garden. But you can see there's actually several different kinds of milkweeds that you can plant, and they all have different color flowers and different kinds of leaves. However, having said that, you can't just plant a milkweed and that's it because the milkweed is what the caterpillars will eat when they are first born. But once you have an adult monarch butterfly, they actually need other kinds of flowers as well. So, prairie blazing star, the Maximilian sunflower, Joe Pye weed, cup plant, boneset, stiff goldenrod, wild bergamot, all of these kinds of flowers are also important because they provide nectar for the monarch butterflies. And then earlier I was talking about rusty patch bumblebee because that is another species of interest that we have. One of the most important things with the rusty patch bumblebee is just making sure that you have a variety of blooms so that there's always something throughout the growing season. So, for example, the Virginia bluebells and the columbines are going to be something that comes out early in the spring and gives them a source of nectar then. You're going to find the blazing star and the bergamot and the hyssop coming into bloom sometime during the summer. And then as we get into fall, the asters and the goldenrods are going to be really important. So you can't leave out any of those seasons when you are planting the flowers. This is just an illustration that I really love that shows, kind of those groupings of the spring, early summer, late summer, fall. Think of it as being very seasonal and making sure that you have something that's always blooming. And in practical terms, the way I've done this in my yard is that I plant the garden and 3 years later I walk out in May or June and I'm looking at it and I'm like, ugh, nothing's blooming. I guess I need to plant something that blooms at this month, and you just kind of keep doing that and you keep adding on until eventually you always have something blooming. Another thing that you might not be thinking about, though, is not just planting the flowers, but also having places where the bees can be nesting in the ground. So we don't want to be using landscape fabric. We don't want to use any of that landscape rock. You can put down mulch, but it's okay to have a couple of bare spots because there are all of these ground nesting birds. And there's a lot of other animals, honestly, that will get down into the ground and be able, need to get access to the ground to hibernate during the winter time as well. Okay, and I'm just kind of checking where can you get the poster of the monarch flowers? Is it the one that was the seasons one that I was just showing? A flower patch for the rusty patch. Looks like Wildlife Preservation Canada is where we got this one from. Yep, Wildlife Preservation Canada. Okay. So a couple of other powerhouse plants to introduce to you. I mentioned earlier the importance of having those early spring blooms. So one that I think is particularly nice to plant in your yard if you're looking for a small tree is a wild plum, because look at the gorgeous flowers that they have. Everybody loves to have those gorgeous flowers. And then also you get plums. And that's pretty exciting too, to have plums that, yes, you can pick and you can eat. So good for the birds, good for you. And if you would maybe like to have a Luna moth in your yard, one moment. If you would maybe like to have a Luna moth in your yard, be thinking also about some of the larger trees like cherry, walnut, birch, maple, sumac, oaks, and willows, because moths don't just need the flowers, they also need the trees and the tree bark. Okay, so another powerhouse plant that is really good for a lot of different species is the bee balm, also known as Monarda. And this one is great because it is an attractant for just a whole bunch of different kinds of butterflies and bees. And I think that this comes to the point in time where you even get to hear past tense Angie talk as I show you some of these flowers and insects in action.
This is a female eastern tiger swallowtail butterfly, and they look nothing like the males. The males are always yellow, but the females can be either yellow or black. They live in the central and eastern United States, and I want to show you a few of the native plants that you can plant in your yard to bring them to your yard. First up is purple coneflower, also known as echinacea, and this one is always a crowd favorite. Next up is bergamot or monarda, which is also called bee balm. The native version is purple. Ohio spiderwort, this one opens during the day and closes at night, which is kind of fun. Joe pieweed, this is a tall plant which is excellent for wetlands and other wet spaces. And lastly, common ironweed, which is another great plant for wet places.
Okay, thank you, past tense Angie. Past tense Angie is also going to tell you about the Virgin's Bower. I get a lot of questions on what flower it is that I have creeping over my arbor. And let me tell you the pros and cons about it. The pro is obviously it's gorgeous. It gets these beautiful, just abundant white flowers during the summertime, and it is absolutely covered in all sorts of different species of birds and wasps. If any of you are familiar with Virgin's Bower, though, it is a creeper. It's a creeper. And so in order to keep it under control, I do have to constantly during the summer go out there and trim off all of those creepers that are trying to go off into the shrubs or off into my neighbor's yard.
Check out this gorgeous vine growing on our trellis. This is called Virgin's Bower. It's native to the central and eastern United States, and as you can tell, it is a pollinator magnet. It starts blooming in late summer, and as soon as it does, the entire vine literally buzzes with life. There are all sorts of giant black wasps and bees. It sounds like it's scary, but if you can tell, I'm right up here against the flowers and have never yet been stung by these bees and wasps. They're just out there collecting their nectar. Virgin's Bower is a type of clematis, and it can be trained to climb over an arbor or up a tree if you want it to be there instead.
Okay. So last but not least, you get all excited and we want to send you away with some good resources where you can learn more about the gardens, find, that really one-on-one assistance to design your garden, find help through grants and get started. So, Lori, I think it's back to you again.
All right. Maybe.
Okay. Whoops. Well, see, then I tried to help you by clicking.
Right. So definitely the Washington Conservation District, as Angie pointed out, we've got a lot of folks in the office that can be very helpful. And one of the big ones is the free site visit. So for folks that live in Washington County, we have on the homepage, there's a site sign up. You can go in there, sign up for a site visit, and somebody will connect with you and they will come out and do an assessment of your site and help you do some planning and some thinking about what you might do. One of the other exciting things is the Conservation District received a Pollinator Pathways Program grant. And in a minute, I'll show you some of the communities we're going to work with. A couple of years ago, it was the part of the Lawns to Legumes demonstration neighborhoods where we had worked with a number of neighborhoods in Washington County. For example, worked with Landfall, the mobile home park area, and planted 5 different pollinator gardens in that community. So the Pollinator Pathways Program is a 2-year grant that the Conservation District has received, and we'll be looking to work with residents in a variety of neighborhoods. There are cost share grants, as Angie mentioned earlier, that are available through local watershed districts. Another thing I want to mention is the tree sale that's currently going on. Most of the trees are gone. The Conservation District, if you go to the web page, the trees are gone. There's a couple of trees left, and I think maybe buckthorn seed grass replacement along those lines. But what I want to tell you is that The Conservation District is working with the Minnesota Native Landscape, and they will have a rusty patch bumblebee garden or a butterfly garden in which you receive 36 forbs, different forbs that are good for the rusty patch bumblebee or for butterflies. And they are half off what it would cost you if you bought it directly from the Minnesota landscape or native landscape. So if you're interested in getting a good start, 36 forbs, I believe, and some grasses for $65, which is a really good bargain for 36 plugs that you'll be able to plant. They will need protection, though. Trust me, those little bunny herbivores will mow them down. And then, as Angie mentioned, we have a number of resources on the website on the Conservation District with the Planting for Clean Water slides from and recordings from previous workshops. There are some print resources and a variety of other pieces of information. Did I forget anything? All right.
Ah, there we go.
As I mentioned, we have the Pollinator Pathway program that will be occurring over the next 2 years, and we'll be working with a number of communities. So we'll be working with in Stillwater, the Croywood neighborhood, Oakdale, neighborhoods that are draining into the Battle Creek Lake, St. Paul Park, Newport, and Afton, and we're looking to install pollinator-friendly projects that include native gardens, pollinator meadows, tree and shrub plantings, and pollinator lawns. So we are excited to offer this to residents in these areas. And the best way to do that is to sign up for a site visit if you want to learn more about that and connect with some WCD staff folks. Whoops. So here are here's a picture of the communities that we're working with and kind of the sweet spots. Those were identified, as you can tell with the map on the left, high potential zones for the rusty patch bumblebee. And so those are the 5 communities that we'll be working with and kind of the general areas in which we'll be looking to recruit residents to participate in this opportunity. And then we mentioned the watershed cost share grants. Again, requesting a site visit will also help you connect with the watershed cost share grants in Browns Creek. That's in the center there, the green area. They have stewardship grants. Carmar, or Carnelian Marine St. Croix, those are the best management practice assistance for individuals. Comfort Lake, Forest Lake, native plantings and shoreline restoration assistance. They have both mini grants and community cost share grants. Middle St. Croix Water Management Organization has a stewardship grant. And then our remaining 4 watersheds, Ramsey Washington Metro, which kind of hits that Oakdale, Woodbury, you can see that area. Stewardship and maintenance grants, Rice Creek, mini grants and water quality grants. South Washington Watershed District has water quality cost share program grants. And then Valley Branch has a best management practices grant program on native plant grants. So there are lots of opportunities out there living in these watershed districts that will help you offset some of the costs. And as Angie said, some of them are $500, which gets you a lot, especially if you're doing a pocket planting. You can get a lot done with $500 and a pocket planting. We talked a little bit about the Lawns to Legumes program. And not to brag, but I was excited in January when I was notified that I received a Lawns to Legumes grant. So I am all excited to do a 3rd pollinator garden and do some soft landings around a couple of trees that could use some plantings. The Lawns to Legumes right now, they are accepting grants for the fall. There is just a slight little bit of a hiccup. with the Lawns to Legumes program. It was not in the governor's budget, and there is bills in both the House and Senate that are looking to end the Lawns to Legumes program. So hopefully it will not, that will not happen, and we will continue with Lawns to Legumes over the next few years. It's been a very, very beneficial program, and very lots of folks have benefited from that, and definitely for our pollinators and our other beneficial insects, it's been a big plus. The Board of Water and Soil Resources, who actually helps with the pollinator pathways, they are the ones that we receive the funding from. And then also the Lawns to Legumes, they work on that with Blue Thumb and Metro Blooms. They have a wonderful guide, Planting for Pollinators. This is a really nice, handy guide, and it's on their website. Very easy to work with. They also have templates for different types of plantings for sunny low gardens, rain gardens, and shade gardens. Nice thing is it gives you the plants, gives you an idea for planting. And on the back side, if the plants that they've suggested on the front don't work for you, they give you alternate plants that could also serve in those roles. So it's a really wonderful site. And then, whoops, they also have Plant of the Month, and I'm sharing this one. It's on the white turtlehead, and that article was provided by Brett Stoppelstead, who is one of our landscape folks that works at the Conservation District. So, and white turtlehead is such a fun plant. Blue Thumb, their website is wonderful for resources. They have all kinds of do-it-yourself information, templates. It's just a phenomenal website with lots of information. One of the other things that they have is that they do have free workshops that you can sign up for. So the document on the far left, Creating Resilient Landscapes, comes from their workshop. You can sign up for them. They're free. They're all online. And they're typically between 10 to 12 lessons. And they usually aren't any more than 10 to 12 minutes long. So you can do 2 or 3 of them in a sitting, come back to it later. Very, very wonderful. And then just some other wonderful resources that they've got. This is one of my favorite things that's on the Blue Thumb site is the plant finder. So here's a picture of prairie smoke, which is a really nice plant, a fun plant. And the thing about the plant finder is if you know the plant, you can type the plant's name in and it'll pop up all kinds of great information for you. Again, this is one of the early blooming plants. Gives you the plant height, where it best grows, the soil moisture conditions, bloom color. And then it also gives you a bunch of other information about that particular plant, like how tolerant it is to flooding, how tolerant it is to salt, stress tolerances. And then it tells you what types of planting projects it best fits. This is one of the things I wished I'd had when I was doing some of my plants, the herbivore sensitivity. So I know that if I plant prairie smoke, I'm going to need to protect my little prairie smoke from those sweet little bunnies and squirrels. So it gives you all kinds of great information. The pollinator value tells you when it blooms, who it might be the larval host for, specific pollinators, and then the benefit. And then you can also get into where you can get the county that it grows in, the ecoregion, and the eco-province if you're interested in this. This is a wonderful little tool. It's really great. There are a few other plant databases that you can use. The Audubon Society, if you're looking at attracting a few birds to the area, you can pop in your zip code and it will give you a variety of native plants in the area and the types of birds. The National Wildlife Federation has a butterfly version. The challenge with this particular site is it's still in a beta version, so it doesn't always have the nice cool pictures, but it does have lots of great information. Again, you type your zip code in and you've got the information on plants that might be useful for attracting butterflies. Minnesota Wildflower is a great website to look at plants, and one of the benefits of this particular site is it also lets you know which ones are native plants and which ones may not be native. Maybe they are European brought over by Europeans or Asian countries. It also lets you know if it's in an invasive and what you need to do with it. So this is a great website for resources. The other thing I like are some of our nurseries in the state of Minnesota, native plant nurseries. Prairie Moon has some great information on their site. So for the lead plant, this gives you all kinds of information about the lead plant, tells you its range, good information. And then another great site, Blazing Star Gardens, they have a pollinator garden tool, which I'm starting to play with. It takes a little bit of work, but it does have some wonderful information. And again, they're another great source, along with many nurseries in nurseries in Minnesota and Wisconsin that have native plants. So that's a great tool. And then there are all kinds of great books out there. And I think Angie's going to hold up a couple of her books, maybe. I've gotten into Heather Holmes' website is really good, but she also has a couple of great books. The flower bugs, if you're really interested in looking at all kinds of different true bugs that you can attract to your yard. And then Bringing Nature Home, kind of one of the seminal texts on sustaining wildlife with native plants. Did you want to hit a couple others?
Oh, sure. I'm not sure if people can see me on if you kind of turn some of my video screen is on.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
No. Well, we can just wait till the end of the slides and I'll share them and then maybe go through some of the questions in the chat.
Right. And then websites, and we'll send this information out as well. There are just all kinds of great resources. The Department of Natural Resources has a plant encyclopedia. The U of M, they've got all kinds of different information. If you're looking at specific other resources, Xerxes Society has great stuff. The Pollinator Friendly Alliance, the Bee Lab. Another one that's really fun is the Grow It, Build It blog. Again, they do all kinds of great stuff on talking about the native plants, the types of pollinators that are attracted to it, and just some great resources all together. And we'll thank you in just a minute, but I just wanted to share this last picture. This was my first pollinator garden. And I went out one day to take a look and see what was going on. And I saw this critter out there. And at first my heart stopped because I thought, oh my gosh, what will this giant wasp do to me? I was a little concerned about it because if you take a look at the end of the wasp, you can see a black line going down that goes all the way from the back end of the wasp down into the ground. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm in big trouble. Well, what it is it's a giant ichneumon wasp. And that is actually an ovipositor. And so she wasn't going to sting me. She was probably laying some eggs in there into the mulch. But the nice thing about them is that they do oftentimes deposit their eggs into trees. That ovipositor can drill into trees and they lay their eggs in there. And so then when their larvae hatch, they go after some of the parasites that might be in the trees. And so with my willow tree there, she might have been visiting it, or my birch tree. But I haven't ever seen one again. And so it's really fun, the types of things, insects that you will attract to your native gardens. And I'll turn it back to you, Angie.
All right. Well, I say I'm stopping the share so that I can actually, I thought I was stopping the share. There you go. So that I can more easily see people and also questions. And a couple of the questions I answered in the chat as people were asking them, but it's always kind of nice to share it verbally out loud. Way back in the early slides, I had shared an outdated map of the Rusty Patch Bumblebee territory. And then as we got a little further along, Lori actually shared a slide that had the more updated map. So we'll make sure to update our slides before the next time we share this presentation. But yeah, they have actually found Rusty Patch bumblebees in several more locations in the Twin Cities area in Washington County, now that people are actively out there and looking for them. So let's see, there was a question, is there an equivalent of the Washington Conservation District in other counties? And the answer is yes. that most counties in Minnesota have soil and water conservation districts. The only exception is Hennepin County, where it has been merged with Hennepin County Environmental Services. But in just about every other county, there is a soil and water conservation district. And some of the SWCDs do not have nearly the abundance of staff that we have in Washington. A lot of them only have 2 or 3 staff people, but in all cases, they'll be able to provide similar kinds of expertise. So then there was a question about Washington and Ramsey County having soil amendments. And I was wondering if you wanted to talk about that at all, Lori, since you were doing a lot of work with soil health last year.
Yeah. For most of our native plants, they don't need a lot of soil amendments. Most of them are able to grow in a lot of different soil conditions. What really becomes the bigger issue with the soil is the compaction. So if you have very compacted soil, especially with tender, like if you have the plugs, planting new plants, they're going to have a hard time getting their roots to set into it. So compaction can be an issue, but you shouldn't have to do a lot of soil amendments. Now, we were talking about the heavy clay soil. That example that I showed with my last summer's pollinator garden, I did go ahead and amend that with some compost. We have a lot of trees on our property. And so every fall they get raked into our compost piles. And by the next spring, they're ready to go. So what I did is I did use that and mix that in for a year using just composted leaves and grass and stuff into that area to kind of loosen it up a little bit and so that there's a little more porosity into the soil so the roots can get in there, water can get down in there. But for the most part, you shouldn't have to do a lot of soil amending. But with a heavy clay soil, you may want to look at using compost. The other thing you want to be very careful with when you're adding amendments and doing things is the soil disturbance. There are a lot of wonderful little microbes that live in that soil, especially in that top layer of the topsoil, that if you do too much disturbance, you'll kill off some of the good microbes and some of the other beneficial insects that do live in the soil, such as some of the beetles and stuff that create some of those air pockets in there. So you want to be really careful with what you're adding to it. So I would recommend, maybe doing a little bit of compost in it and just slightly hand digging it in. Don't use a tiller, those types of things to till it into the soil. But if you can do it by hand, that would be, that would be more beneficial than tilling it in.
Great, thank you. I just am going to jump in just for a second. So I've got a bunch of black-eyed Susan out there that is doing fantastic. The purple coneflower is not doing fantastic. I think it's got that blight. It's been there for about 25 years, so perhaps maybe it's also at the end of its life. But I also have things in my backyard that I want to move into the front. So just kind of selectively kind of taking things out and maybe amending in little bits and pieces, but I can keep the work around the stuff that's working well up front. That'd be the approach, maybe. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that would work well.
Thank you.
And that's kind of what I've done. I found that one of the tick seeds that I have just is not doing well, and so it's coming out this year. What happens is it gets the little buds on it, it's ready to bloom, and somebody comes and eats all the buds. And so I'm going to move it and put it someplace else where I can protect it more. But since it's an established bed, being really careful not to disturb the well-growing stuff. But yeah, I think doing a little chunk of it, and like Angie was talking with her experiments with her yards and stuff, you find that some things do really well, and some things die back. They've reached their life expectancy, and then you have to, bring in some of the new stuff. Seed collecting will be next on my list of things to learn how to do.
Yeah. You will also learn that you just need to accept the fact that you do have to sometimes weed out plants that are good plants. If you don't want your garden to get out of control, or if you don't want the good plants that are kind of bossy to take over the good plants that are a little bit meek. And I used to have, just psychologically, I had a really hard time with that in the beginning because it's like, but this is a good plant and I put it there on purpose and I can't believe that I'm about to weed it or cut it or, get rid of it. But it's just kind of the reality of if it had acres and acres of a wide open prairie, the plants could fight it all out on their own and they could come to an understanding with one another. But if you're dealing with limited space in your yard, don't be afraid to, do some deadheading, do a little bit of dividing, do some of that thinning to keep things looking more like a garden. Lori mentioned a couple of other books, so I have my big stack of books, and I was like, oh, I just want to, show them because I do those Heather Holmes books. She's got two that I have. One is the bees, and one is the pollinators of native plants. And I mean, I refer to these books over and over and over. So it's fun because you can do it in both directions. You can either say, well, I have this kind of bee and I want to know I want to know what to plant for this kind of bee. Or else you can say, I have yellow coneflower. What can I expect to find on it? So those are two fun ones. But a couple of other newer ones, Prairie Up. This is by Benjamin Voigt, and he is kind of nationally known as a native plant advocate and landscape designer. So this is a fun little book that just came out last year. Another one that came out just last year is called Sand and Fire. This is by Dave Peters, and it is all about the pine barrens, which are a globally rare ecosystem that you can find in northwestern Wisconsin around like the St. Croix and Namakagon rivers. So that was, kind of fun to read about that, especially if you go up in that Hayward Cable area ever. And then lastly, a lot of people are probably familiar with Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braided Sweetgrass, and she has a new book out called The Serviceberry. And so that is, I was so surprised at how little and cute it was when it showed up. I was expecting it to be bigger, but that was a fun new book as well. Mary asking about, can you plant over your septic system? And the answer is yes. Just beware of rooty, of like, shrubs and trees and things that have like those really tree-like roots. But if you are planting more like the grasses and the forbs, it should be okay.
And I think Minnesota Native Landscapes, if you go to their website, I think they have information on plantings for septic for those areas.
Yeah, and flowers are okay too. It's just avoid things that are like the shrubs, things that are going to have woody roots to them. Yeah. I will send out an email tomorrow to everyone that should have links to all sorts of resources that were mentioned today. And so that makes it a little easier too if you're having trouble taking notes as we were talking. Michelle asking, do you have any good ideas on how to incorporate a native garden in a school setting? We certainly have lots of examples, and I will also tell you that it's hard because there's a whole lot of people that you have to convince in order to get the permission to do a school project. And it can also be challenging to find somebody who is going to commit to taking care of those gardens year round. Usually you'll have a teacher who's really excited about it, but then the teachers aren't working during the summertime, which is when the gardens need the most, tending and maintenance and watering. So to be successful, it's really good if you also have like a PTO or a parent group, that's going to commit to coming during those summer months and, actually taking care of the gardens. We do have 7 or 8 schools in the South Washington County School District where the Watershed District and School District actually partnered, and they didn't just do a garden, like they took like several acres of non-active turf out of commission and restored it as either prairie or other native habitat. So in those examples, then they actually have contractors who are out there and doing, regular prescribed burns like you would for a larger habitat. Counterintuitively, sometimes I almost feel like it's easier to take care of one giant prairie than to try to take care of one small garden and keep it looking socially acceptable the way people want it to.
I think Jean had a question about leafcutter beetles and what
Yeah.
kinds of plants. They're like all kinds of plants. And with all bee species, some of them are specialist bees, and they only pollinate or take nectar from certain plants. But a majority of leafcutter bees are generalists, and so a variety of plants will be good for them. And I can't remember if on the Bee Lab, I'm trying to remember, there are a couple of sites that you can do a search and it'll give you more specific information on which plants. I know one of Heather Holmes' book, it definitely has the native plant and the different types of species of bees, moths, and butterflies that are attracted to those plants. But they're primarily generalists, and so they like lots of things.
Yeah.
Native and our cultivated gardens with our cultivars. They'll go after everything.
Okay, well, I am going to go ahead and turn off our recording. Thank you for joining us, everybody.